Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are continuing the Great Ideas in Psychology series. This is part 10 based on chapter 10 of the book by Fatali Muqaddam. Let's get to the slides and I will share with you the announcements since we have reached the midpoint in the series. Chapter 10, Zone of Proximal Development, inspired directly by the works and ideas of Lev Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist. Here we are in the map of the course of the series, chapter 10. And here is my announcement, which I alluded to. I anticipated it in part 8, but here is the formal announcement, formal invitation. Here's what I would like to invite you to do. Pick one of the videos in the series from part 1 or part 2 up to part 10. Anything, any one or several parts that you like. That seemed important or attractive to you, interesting to you. And write a commentary around 300 words. It could be 200 words, 400 words, but not too long. And in this commentary, you could critique, extend, introduce an extension or continuation of something we talked about, I talked about, or clarify. So you could criticize, extend, or clarify one or several ideas that we covered, or my presentation, something about my presentation or something about the ideas themselves. So I hope this is clear, the format. It's quite flexible. And I will select one person and will send them a signed copy of my book, Experimental Psychology and Human Agency. I've already sent one copy to Paviel, who has been following the series and has shared several really thoughtful comments on previous installments in the series. And there is also a really interesting and thought-provoking comment on the previous video, part 9, by Chris. So Chris's contribution is already included in this round of commentaries. And he might also be selected. All right, if you have any questions about this, you can also ask me. The commentaries, you can just send them to me, or you can write them as a comment under the video. That might be best. All right, zone of proximal development. Let's get to today's discussion. We are talking about an idea introduced by Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky's ideas are about the role of the environment and the interactions between a person who is growing up, who's developing psychologically. There's the psyche of the child, the psyche of the person is being formed through a process of education, through a process of interaction, by exchanging with the environment, by relying on the environment. So what a child needs, what the child gets from the environment, ideally, hopefully, is a constructive support, a scaffolding. Scaffolding is a really great metaphor. And this scaffolding holds the individual and launches them. We can say the environment, including the social environment, achieves the emergence of the individual, the emergence of the person. The person is achieved through the work of the people who are around in the environment that are supporting the person, the child, who's becoming a person. You can contrast this way of viewing psychology with the assumptions behind IQ tests, for example, that separate aptitude, the concept of aptitude, from the concept training. So you can say, no matter how much training you receive, there is that core aptitude that we can test using IQ tests. You can also contrast Vygotsky with earlier stage theories of developments like Piaget. So with Piaget's framework, within Piaget's framework, an adult, including a parent, or we can include a psychologist, a child psychologist. For Piaget, a child psychologist is an observer, primarily an observer, because the development is self-regulated. The development of a child is driven internally. The child's biology is determining how the development of a child, including the psychology of the child, how it is developing, progresses over time. Even if you change the child's environment, she will still go through the same stages because development is self-regulated, not externally. You cannot really change the process of development by external intervention, according to these traditional stage models. If you examine, again, with these assumptions, if you examine children in artificial settings like a laboratory or maybe classroom, you can better understand their development. So you don't intervene with the development by observing them in the lab, by doing experiments on them. You're observing them. So this is according to Piaget. We are repeating these assumptions behind the traditional approaches before Vygotsky, or separate from Vygotsky, in contrast with Vygotsky. These are passages from the textbook. The traditional approach makes two important assumptions about testing. First, that the unit of concern in testing is the individual and only the individual. Many psychologists today have this assumption. Second, the traditional approach assumes that aptitude and training are independent. So there's an aptitude that is independent of your training, like an IQ test, a general intelligence factor, that we can just design the right test and measure it. And that measure will not be sensitive to how much education you have received, how you were treated as a child, and the training you received. Anyways, Vygotsky reacted to these assumptions, and he was particularly successful in introducing a fundamentally different way of thinking about psychology, thinking about education, thinking about development. So he put forth a more dynamic view of the environment. Environment is no longer a static, just an arbitrary, indifferent place where the person is growing up, developing, learning. Environment itself is dynamic, is in exchange with the organism, with the person, with the child. So he put forth a more dynamic view of the environment and identified important new behaviors that arise out of the person-environment interactions. Here is one of the famous books by Vygotsky, Thought, and translated as Thought and Language. It's interesting to note that during the Soviet era, even after he had passed away, from around the mid-1930s until the late 1950s, Vygotsky's publications were banned in the Soviet Union because they were seen by the Soviet authorities as ideologically unsound. Ideologically unsound. Why? Because he saw language as the primary medium for the mind, for mental activities. So language for him was really important, and that stood in important contrast with the assumptions of Marxist psychology, materialist psychology, because he saw the importance of language and how we live psychologically within language as our medium. So one of his core ideas was that mental development is primarily based on social relationships between children and family members. One of the things that children pick up by observing and by interacting with older members of their family is they pick up ideal forms, they pick up concepts that are relatively abstract, like the concept of a man, or a concept of a father, or a concept of a woman, or a concept of a mother. And they start experimenting with these concepts themselves, or maybe other concepts like carpenter, what a carpenter is, or a welder. And they play with these concepts, and their play is a way of exploring and getting more familiar with the concepts or ideal forms that they're picking up through their interactions. Even aspects of psychology that are generally believed to be inside the individual, like personality traits, are for Vygotsky products of social exchange. So personality traits like you might think you're shy or bold or quiet or talkative or sensitive, emotional, or friendly or cold, or somebody, you might describe these traits as things that are attributable. You attribute them to the individual as separate from the social context. from the social environment. But for Vygotsky, even personality traits arise out of our social life. It is first in our social life that we are introduced to these traits, how we enact these traits, how we can live these traits, perform these traits, and then they become part of our psychology. So where does it begin? It begins in language, culture, and material practices. These factors form the mind of an individual: language, culture, and material practices. So language and culture are relatively familiar to us, but what are material practices? Those are also familiar to us, with some examples. In many cultures, in many educational systems, we have the practice of copying text for homework. This is a practice that forms the mind of the child who is doing it. Sitting quietly in a classroom, entering into an asymmetric relationship with the teacher who has the authority in the class. That's also a practice. Repeatedly doing it, it's a practice. Behaving appropriately at social occasions, like at a funeral, at a wedding, at a magic show. Every time you participate in these social occasions and you behave appropriately, repeat what is appropriate, embody what is appropriate, those are material practices. So every time we participate, we become part of a group activity. So we join an activity that is larger than us. In other words, we join a joint activity done with others, together with others. This gives us the definition of the zone of proximal development. The joint activity where the child is learning about a concept and acting based on the concept for the first time. It is the joint activity where the child is being introduced and is starting to explore the meaning of a concept for the first time. Without that joint activity, the child will have a hard time, if it is possible at all, to learn about this concept, to learn about this ideal form. Here's a very useful passage from Vygotsky, because the passage clarifies the stages of learning. Like every time we learn something, a new concept, first it is in the context of a social exchange. Then it becomes something that we internalize, we can imagine within our mind. So let's read this. Every function in the child's cultural development appears twice. First on the social level and later on the individual level. First between people, interpsychological, and then inside the child, intrapsychological. This applies equally to voluntary attention, to logical memory, and to the formation of concepts. All the higher functions originate as actual relationships between individuals. So you can think about relationships, the role of relationships in learning and in cultural development, when you think about different forms of exchange between teachers and students, different forms of going back and forth, dialogue. So for example, we can think about instruction and how that is different from a conversation. These are different modes of interacting with someone, and both can result in learning, but they're different. Let's go through some of their attributes, especially in contrast with each other. So an instruction gives you a place, but that is a relatively fixed place. And it's a place where you can receive commands, you can receive instructions, what you're supposed to do. Do this. Again, instruction, you can fail to follow what the instructions that you receive. Instructions are usually rigid. That means the same instruction is given to everybody with very slight modifications. Instructions are directed at a predetermined goal. The goal is determined, and because of the goal, you are giving or receiving instructions. Now, by contrast, a conversation lets you find your place and role. You don't fail at a conversation. If a conversation fails, it's not your failure. It is the failure of the whole activity. Everybody involved is failing. It's a collective failure. Conversation is flexible. That's another difference. Finally, Conversations have or give freedom to play and discover new goals, goals that you did not set in the beginning. This is why I prefer to have conversations that are educational, that a mode of approaching education and learning that is based on conversation, because the roles are flexible, the roles are not determined in advance, the goals are not determined in advance, and it's not the student's failure if things don't work out. Instruction is a one-way street, conversation is a two-way street. So in an instructional educational setting, the child is being introduced to an ideal form. This is how teachers behave. So imagine if you have a strict teacher and you also later become a teacher, what kind of teacher will you become? Assuming that you internalize this form of being a teacher is somebody who gives instructions, then you are likely going to be an instruction-based, instruction-oriented teacher, if that's how you were taught. Because we don't just learn about the contents of our instructions, we also learn about those ways of participating, those positions, those roles. We are being introduced to those roles of a student, the role of a teacher. So that structure of a dialogue, that scaffold for learning, we carry that forward in the next generation of students that we will teach later on. Here's a question. In our textbook, Fatali Muqaddam writes about the advantages and resources. So he writes about some children growing up in advantageous conditions. What does that mean? Understanding Vygotsky's idea, and particularly understanding the zone of proximal development, means understanding the answer to this question. What does it mean for a child to grow up in an advantageous condition? Does it mean with a lot of money? Does it mean in a big house, with a house with lots of rooms in it? Does it mean a lot of toys? It means, among other things, it means for us students of psychology, for us it means symbolic resources. So in addition to material resources, adults can provide cultural linguistic resources, which offer to the child concepts to learn, concepts to embody, concepts to experiment with, things to do, activities to engage in. These activities are ideal forms about learning. So the child can learn what learning means, what is the aim of learning. The child can learn the ideal form of trust. This is how we trust each other. This is how we promise things to each other and then we fulfill those promises. That is a concept. That is a symbolic resource. Just imagine a child who never learns about a trusting relationship, or like the ethical codes of a game that you play. You have to have good sportsmanship, or show character, not just win. The ideal forms of play, ideal forms of arguing, conflict resolution. So those are all resources that the child can learn through these zones of learning. Children can start by imitating these forms. It doesn't matter if it is initially mindless imitation, and then the child can experience them from within in a subjective way. You might be now reminded of Plato's ideas in the Republic. So imitation is crucial, but imitation then has to be followed by this subjective experience, which is followed. The zones of proximal development, finally, can be different. And if you have lots of resources, you can address those differences, the different needs of different children. So one child might need one type of joint activity to understand the meaning of arguing or trust. And another child might need another method, another kind of joint activity to learn the same concept, the same ideal type. So this is it for Vygotsky and zone of proximal development. Next, we will get to attachment and say a few things about attachment theory, attachment style. It is still about the interactions between adults and children, but this is really a topic that addresses the emotional aspect of that relationship, the emotional bond between children and adults. If you enjoy this series, please support the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing. And for more content, more exclusive videos, you can visit Patreon. I also have reading groups that meet almost every Sunday morning, Eastern time. Other than that, thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching, and we will continue the discussion next time. Till then.